Hello, I'm Dr. Alison from Westminster College in Cambridge, where I'm a biblical studies tutor, and I'm here with Dr. Ayla Lepine, an art historian and an ordinand at Westcott House, also in Cambridge. We're here to discuss the painting behind us, and Ayla, I wonder if you might start by giving us an introduction to what this painting is.
Yeah, it's from about 1575, and it's by Jacapo Palma, and this late 16th century kind of style. If you look at the bright blue, at the pink of the rippling of the angel's clothing, at that real contrast between light and dark, those are things that are really quite typical, not only of biblical painting, but of history painting in general, grand subject matter from this main period in the late 16th century, right towards the end of all of the fruitful types of art history that we know so well and that we love so well from the main Italian Renaissance. And so what we're seeing here is a really kind of classic mode of painting, but the way that this artist has dealt with these two figures and dealt with this story is in fact relatively unusual. Can you help us unpack this story? So what's happening with Elijah? Who is that other figure, and why does this matter? Why paint this subject?
Okay, so this painting depicts a scene from 1 Kings 19 when Elijah is being visited by an angel, and we have the provision of cake and a jug of water, which is beautiful, sort of almost central in the painting there. It's a little way into the Elijah saga, so that begins in chapter 17 with King Ahab becoming king. Now Ahab is described as one of the kings who does evil in the sight of the Lord more than all of the others previously, and he's married to Jezebel, who was a Baal fanatic, so a worshipper of Baal.
Big fan.
Absolutely. Now, the background to this, the theme of food and provision is really central in the Elijah saga. So there is drought in the land and famine, and it's understood by the writer to be a sort of a divine response to Ahab's wickedness. There is going to be drought in the land. There is no more provision, precisely because Baal is a prophet connected with fertility of the land. So there's drought and there's famine, and what's happening here is actually a sort of an anticlimax after the drama of chapter 18 on Mount Carmel, where Elijah, as the single prophet of the Lord remaining, is having a face-off with the prophets of Baal, 450 of them, both of them trying to call down fire on an altar for a sacrifice.
So he's really outnumbered, it's very aggressive.
Yes.
There's this real sense of almost macho religious competition, not only between these men, but also between Israel and this really very different and utterly pagan religion.
Precisely. And so Elijah calls down fire from heaven, and his sacrifice has been drenched in water, just to make an even further point. The Lord can do all these things. So the fire comes down from heaven and the sacrifice is complete. And at the very end of the chapter, Elijah orders the prophets of Baal to be gathered up, and they are all killed. So a mass slaughter. So Jezebel obviously isn't very happy about this, and she is seeking his life, but in the narrative gives him fair warning, which is always good for the story. So at this point he has fled south to Judah, away from any kind of sphere of her authority and power, and he's left his servant at Beersheba.
So he's alone.
He's completely alone. He's wandered further into the wilderness, and he's experiencing a depression, which is rather strange in the light of this overwhelming victory in the previous chapter. But he asks to die, and this is where Moses and Elijah have a number of overlapping themes or motifs. So Moses in Numbers 11 also wants to die and feels that his job is too much for him, it's too much for him to bear. So, and he just wants to sleep. So he falls asleep under this tree, and while he's sleeping, having asked God to die, an angel comes and wakes him up and says, "Get up and eat." And
he doesn't look very pleased with that. We'll talk about his posture in just a minute, because it's so fascinating. But he doesn't seem delighted by it, as though his melancholy and his stupor remains, even though he has this divine messenger who's turned up with cake and is going to help him out.
Yes. What's so funny is that you don't expect to find cake baked on hot coals or a jug of water in the wilderness, and that's what the story says, and we have this beautifully represented in the painting. But the jug is quite an unusual word in Hebrew, and we've met it just a bit earlier in the Elijah saga when Elijah goes to the widow's house and is looked after there. Again, another story of Elijah being provided for. The meal doesn't run out, the oil doesn't run out, and so she can keep baking bread for him. And here we have a jug, and this time full of water to revive him. And the angel comes twice and does the same thing. So he says, get up and eat, and he has some food, and he goes back to sleep, and the angel comes again, wake up and eat. And then he is nourished and is able to carry on the rest of his journey.
The kind of position that we see here is something that's really grounded in contrast. So we have this real contrast between the darkness of Elijah's shadow of melancholy, his exterior state, created by the artist, reflecting his interior emotional state because of his desperation at feeling abandoned and being utterly isolated with a task far too large for him to be able to bear. That's transformed in an instant by the appearance of this dynamic, energetic angel, its wings hovering in the air, its cloths billowing around it.
Very colourful, isn't it?
Very colourful. And then the shadow around Elijah is not anymore physically the shadow of his emotional state, but the shadow of the protective wings of God. Hidden under the shadow of God's own wings, he's also nourished by God's own miraculous food. You were saying earlier that the appearance of jugs filled with nourishment and cakes, and the fact that these things do not run out, is a sense of assurance that God, even in the darkest of places, is going to be with this prophet as he goes from place to place on his journey. It's also really quite complex in the way that the composition puts these two heads together and rotates, in the way that the arms and the muscles of the figures rotate, in the way that this actually is divided almost 1/3, 2/3 by the outstretched arms of the angel, who's representing not only heavenly hope and this miraculous divine appearance, but this real sense of earthly balance and earthly peace. This is such a physical encounter, which is all about water and cake and carrying on and being exhausted and yet somehow being nourished by this divine presence.
It's fascinating theological interpretation by the painter, isn't it? To get all of that into the posture of the two figures or the placement of the two figures is fascinating. I think one of the things that is really striking to me is that the jug is really shiny.
Yeah.
And it seems a very, can you tell me what's happening there? It seems very different sort of kind of colour than the figures.
Yeah, well, it looks a bit like a kind of like a precious object for sure, possibly something that would be familiar from an upper-class merchant's home and their table in the late 16th century. So it's definitely not attempting to go back to Elijah's own time and to find a kind of contextual earthenware jug that might have been familiar for his own people in his own place.
But
so this jug
of
from
provision.
heaven, this jug from heaven is like the jug from the generous Italian nobleman's table. And there's a real sense of preciousness in that dash of white that the artist has included to give us this glint of interest. And people who saw this in this period, as now, they knew their Bible. So they would be able to look between the arm of the angel and the back and shoulder of Elijah and think, the scene that we can see here is very specifically about provision in the wilderness. And that little white streak is not just the painter saying, look at how well I can paint a reflection. It's also the painter saying, look at this. This is a powerful story of transformation from hopelessness into hope through this divine and miraculous event, which is also so utterly simple. It's not something which is all about gold and jewels and precious fruits. It doesn't have the sensuality of something like the Song of Songs. It's simply, effectively, bread and water. But it is enough for the journey to be able to sustain and to transform this melancholic figure.
Brilliant, thank you.